Good morning, everyone. Apologies for the delay. I guess we're still in the pandemic era, but figuring out technical difficulties. We have a virtual speaker from New Zealand, and I think she should be on with us shortly. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. This panel looks at climate and maritime security issues. And I think it's a conversation that has been carried forward from our discussions from last year, where during the Islands Dialogue, we heard a lot about the disconnect between, or the disconnect on the issue of security or the concept of security itself, where when certain countries or certain regions talk about maritime security, there are multiple avenues and themes around it. Maritime security also includes traditional and non-traditional security issues, but I think bringing forward that conversation from last year, this panel, we're going to explore a little bit more on how small island states are navigating that disconnect between the concept of security and within maritime security as well, and the connection to climate change, because for island states and ocean nations, as a term that we have been hearing since yesterday, those are not very different issues or themes, when ocean is your neighbor, I suppose, and the connection with climate, that is what has a direct impact on. I'm absolutely delighted to have with us today, three speakers that I'm personally looking forward to hear from on issues very much focused on the Pacific. First, to Ambassador Odo Tevi, Vanuatu's permanent representative to the United Nations and the ambassador to the United States. Welcome, Ambassador, and thank you for being with us. Then we have Dr. Tarcisius Kabutaulaka, who's an associate professor in the Department of Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii. And joining us from New Zealand, and I think it's about 1:30 a.m. there, is Dr. Anna Powles, who's a senior lecturer at the Center for Defense and Security Studies. I'm not sure if to provide short, brief framing remarks on the issue, on the topic that you'd like to speak to, and then we'll have a moderated conversation. Hi, Anna. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us so late. Your time, and welcome back to the forum. And then we'll move on to question and answer. So let me turn to you, Ambassador Tevi, first to make your remarks, framing remarks on the issue of climate and maritime security, but also on the lead that Vanuatu is taking in getting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and also like to thank the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for the invitation. As you all know, climate change is the single biggest threat in the Pacific Islands. It affects our development, our prospects for our future economy, but also it poses a threat to our sovereignty. So we have seen that in the last the recent IPCC report, the report clearly stated that 1.5 degrees, we are not able to achieve that, given the current trajectory that we are moving towards. So this is a challenge for small island developing states. So what they will experience is high sea level rise, severe weather patterns like hurricanes. So this is quite challenging for us. And in terms of the UNFFC, we have the national determined contributions. But again, in the last COP, there was a call that we need to enhance or increase our ambition. So I think the ambition element, there's still a gap in there. And we haven't really, in terms of climate financing, we haven't really fulfilled the obligations that were set out in Glasgow. So that's a major challenge. But for us in the Pacific, it is an urgent issue. So that is one of the reasons why Vanuatu is planning to take the issue to the International Court of Justice to seek an advisory opinion on climate change. It's basically to clarify states' obligations on climate change. In terms of the international environmental law, there is clarification there, but not on climate, especially on climate action. But we hope that the advisory opinion will not replace the Paris Agreement or the national determined contribution, but it will be complementary. It will enhance climate action. So that is the hope. It is not legally binding, but it has a legal weight and moral authority.
Thank you, Pastor. Anna, if I may turn to you to provide some of your perspectives and remarks, and I think you on the maritime security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, but also the role of partners, maritime partners in the Pacific region. Over to you, Anna.
Certainly, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to have me here, albeit virtually, this morning, and greetings to our chair and fellow panelists. I'll just make some short comments with respect to the focus of the panel on climate change and maritime security. And as we heard from Prime Minister Sokoveni this morning, he spoke of the climate emergency. These are areas of critical concern for the Pacific, and they're also sites of both collaboration and also contestation. I'm going to talk just briefly first on Aotearoa perspectives on climate and maritime security and how these converge and align with Pacific perspectives. And secondly, and even more importantly, on the nature and impact and implications of the heightened attention on the Pacific. In July, Aotearoa New Zealand's Defence Minister, Tene Hanaga, said that the Pacific is who we are as well as where we are, and challenges that our region faces are New Zealand's challenges. And this includes climate as a security issue. There have been numerous defence statements which have referred to climate change as a complex disruptor, and New Zealand's maritime strategy suggests that New Zealand will face a more challenging and increasingly dynamic and complex maritime security environment. And the latest defence assessment actually called for expanded maritime plan awareness, including greater engagement with Pacific countries and other partners in an increasingly complex and congested strategic space. And it's important here, obviously, to note the point that was made earlier about the disconnect between conceptions of security. Furthermore, there is also a clear sense of the intersecting nature of climate and maritime security, the way in which climate change will contribute to resource competition, such as fisheries, and will intersect like strategic competition with other sources of insecurity in the Pacific, and how illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, transnational crime, challenges to ocean governance and maritime boundaries, as well as how strategic competition will play out in the maritime domain, has the potential to disrupt and undermine the maritime order in the Pacific. And so in these respects, Aotearoa is in alignment with Pacific states on both climate and maritime security. And there are a number of Pacific Islands Forum declarations, from the Boy Declaration through to the 2050 strategy that's endorsed here, which discuss this. And there is clear consensus on both issues. What is really critical, however, is...
Anna, I think we've lost...
Asian re-engage with the Pacific. There have been efforts, some successful, others less so, to shape and create architecture to facilitate that engagement. And this can lead to what I refer to as disruptive diplomacy. In his remarks yesterday, Ambassador Prasad said in reference to this increased engagement in the Pacific that the only frameworks that matter to the Blue Pacific are the frameworks shaped, agreed to, and proposed by the Blue Pacific. And he gave the example of the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. There is a weariness in the Pacific about calls to develop new regional arrangements. In August this year, Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General Henry Puna stated at the inaugural Pacific Regional Law Enforcement Conference that the Pacific should certainly review the existing frameworks, identify loopholes, and establish shared priorities so that as a region, the Pacific can work together to strengthen our resilience and contribute to the achievement of our ambitions under the 2050 strategy, but not create new architecture itself. And this is where there is some concern about initiatives such as the partners in the Pacific, obviously not the United States, Australia, Japan, and the UK, being one example. And my fellow panelists, Dr. Kabutaulaka, asked a question in the previous session about the DPD. It's an informal mechanism intended to support prosperity, resilience, and security in the Pacific, bolster Pacific regionalism, and so forth. And states that will be led and guided by the Pacific Islands, and the Pacific Islands will be sought by the partners in the Pacific in order to execute its projects and activities. However, it is unclear how Pacific buy-in and ownership will be secured for such an initiative, and certainly can't be taken advantage. And this just demonstrates the fact that architecture that's created outside or not in partnership with the existing architecture, the existing regional mechanisms and processes by which such agreements should be developed, that they will merely be seen as efforts to shape the regional order in ways which are potentially favourable. And this speaks to broader concerns about Pacific states and frustrations with respect to having to manage strategic competition and manage the engagement of large actors in the region, given the critical issues that the region are facing and that we're hearing about during the course of this dialogue. And we've seen multiple examples of where Pacific states have pushed back on efforts to shape and develop initiatives by a range of different partners. And the key point here to make is that this heightened attention has potential impact of actually overshadowing and undermining Pacific priorities and agendas, and inadvertently undermining regionalism and distracting from the challenges that Pacific nations have identified themselves, which have been clearly laid out. And this is why issues such as climate and maritime security are so critical, because we see in work that we're doing in a number of different projects, we see the potential for these issues to be potentially hijacked by the concerns of external partners, or to be seen as potential entry points for engagement, and that could be potentially very disruptive. So I'll leave my comments there and look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for bringing out that tension between some of the initiatives in the region and how that's been perceived. Yes, please, feel free to use the podium.
Thank you. I'm moving here because I thought the light was so bright over there and I can't see my notes, but obviously it's not very different over here. But first of all, thank you to Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for the invitation and for making it possible for me to be here, to fly here from Hawaii. My aim is, like my two previous colleague panelists, is to provide some really broad overview and then have discussions that hopefully will uncover a lot of the things. And it is to look at the intersections between maritime security and climate change and the ways in which they influence each other, not only in the Pacific. My focus will be on the Pacific, but I am sure that a lot of the issues that we raise are important to our cousin islands in the Indian Ocean, as well as islands in other parts of the world as well. The Pacific Island countries and territories are often regarded and talked about as small island states. But I think it is vital in the outset to understand that although they are small island states, they are huge maritime states. And this is why in the Pacific Islands you will hear people talking about the region as the blue continent, that the focus is not only on the islands, but it is on the entire Pacific Ocean, or what increasingly in the Pacific Island Forum discussions is often referred to as the Blue Pacific. And that is important because the Pacific Ocean does not necessarily disconnect us. It is for Pacific Island countries our highway that connects us, connects the different island countries, and therefore the relationships that we have and the issues that we share with each other. And so that idea of connection is really, really important. Pacific Island countries are small, but the Pacific Ocean makes up for 30% of our planet's surface area. And therefore we are looking at a region that is important not only to us in the Pacific, but important to our planet. And the reason I say that is that this place is important for humanity and for our planet more generally, rather than just the Pacific. The total exclusive economic zone for Pacific Island countries and territories make up for about 10 million square miles. And this is about 10% of our world's total ocean surface area. And some of the island countries have relatively large EEZ compared to their land area. Tuvalu, for example, has a total land area of 10 square miles and an EEZ of 289,500 square miles. Kiribati has a total land area of 313 square miles and an EEZ of 1.3 million square miles. And so from this, you will see that such a large ocean area is an opportunity, but also presents immense security challenges for the countries that are dependent on these ocean areas or fisheries resources as a source of income and also as a source of subsistence. At the same time, we are seeing an increasing global demand for fisheries products and consequently Pacific Island countries, and this has been mentioned by the Prime Minister of Tonga, Ambassador Prasad, and others previously, that Pacific Island countries have seen an increase in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries, fisheries in the region. For example, we've seen over the years the increase in the blue boats, or what are sometimes referred to as reef robbers, a flotilla of small and medium-sized fishing boats that come into the region from places like Vietnam, and increasingly a lot of Indonesian boats as well, to harvest high-value fisheries products like sea cucumber, giant clam shells, and so forth. And because of that, it has raised increasing concern amongst Pacific Island countries. And also what we've seen over the years is that Pacific Ocean has also become a highway for trafficking illicit drugs, as well as people smuggling. Often the destination is not the Pacific Island countries, it's for places in the rims of the Pacific, but Pacific Island countries are affected by this. And to address this, a lot of the Pacific Island countries lack the capacity, the financial and administrative capacity to be able to do surveillance. And because of that, multilateral arrangements are really important, not only between Pacific Island countries, but also with our development partners outside the Pacific, places like the United States, for instance. Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand have played an important role in these partnerships. And that's something that I think Pacific Island countries want to continue. In terms of fisheries, there are organizations like the Foreign Fisheries Agency and the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission that play an important role. But again, these institutions, while they have the framework for managing fisheries resources, often do not have the capacity to do the surveillance that is required to look after our EEZ and also the international water that we share with others. Now, climate change has been a major issue, and we've heard it yesterday and today, and of course, our ambassador from Vanuatu has also mentioned that, and the push for Vanuatu to take the issue to the International Court of Justice. That is an issue that the Pacific Island leaders through the Boe Declaration in the Pacific Island Forum, have declared as the most important existential threat to the Pacific. And the reason for that is a much broader definition of security. The opportunity that could give rise to potential conflicts. In a lot of Pacific Island, and I'll give one example, in a lot of Pacific Island places, the state does not have access to land. That most land is customary owned. And when you relocate people from one part of the country to another, there is a potential that that could give rise to conflicts over land, conflicts over access to resources as well. And so the potential for domestic conflicts as a result of that. Others have mentioned that in the past decade we've seen an increase in the frequency and intensity of storms and hurricanes. At the moment, I think Japan is experiencing Typhoon Nanmadao, and I think Puerto Rico. They're not, well, Japan's in the Pacific, but this is a global issue that we are concerned about. The other issue I want to raise is the intersections between climate change, maritime security, and geopolitics. As we know, Pacific Islands, or the Oceania region, has become the site for increasing geopolitical competition, particularly between China and the US and its allies. And as a result of that and the increasing need for surveillance, we will, I think, Pacific Island countries will need to partner with all the countries in the region, or countries that have an interest in the region, the US, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and perhaps China as well. But that could become complicated given the geopolitical competitions that we are seeing in the region. The presence of US naval ships in the region, and perhaps the presence of Chinese naval ships in the region to do surveillance could give rise to competition and also to conflicts between these countries. But it does not take away the concern of Pacific Island countries to ensure that our fisheries are protected, to ensure that we address issues of climate change. And there is another issue that I want to leave with you, and that is, the framing of the region and the understanding of the region. You will hear our ambassadors and the Prime Minister mention the reference to the region as the Blue Pacific. And the idea of the Blue Pacific is that we do not only belong to that place, but we have a responsibility to it. We have a responsibility to protecting the Pacific Islands and the Pacific Ocean, and we, I think, expect others to do the same as well. But increasingly, we've seen the region framed in the Indo-Pacific frame. And I think that is not only a description, an identifier of region, but also an expression of a space where some countries have or think they have spheres of influence. And perhaps there is a need to rethink those things. I'll stop here and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tarcisius. That was really great in laying out some of the, again, tensions and conflicting points between maritime security and climate change. Ambassador, I actually wanted to turn to you for a first set of questions on the issue, on the your initiative at the ICJ. Climate change is not something that perhaps gets in front of the International Court of Justice often, or perhaps not happened in the past. So I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit more about the initiative that you are leading from here, and what would you like to see from the advisory opinions, the impact from the advisory opinion, and second, also the support or kind of the partnerships you're seeing in this initiative, whether it is from your own colleagues in the Pacific or from the bigger players in the region who are part of the, who are partners to you, to Vanuatu, but also to the larger region.
Well, thank you. I mean, climate change, it's one of the biggest challenges that the world is facing. It's not only the Pacific, but the Pacific, they're in the front line because they are surrounded by oceans, and we also have severe weather patterns. For example, Vanuatu alone, within 5 years, we had 2 Category 5 cyclones, so that's a new normal for us. So that is the biggest challenge that we are facing. Now, we know that we have the current or the existing architecture in place like the Paris Agreement, the UNFFC, and how we operate the Paris Agreement through the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions. But we know that it is very slow, and there's climate emergency in the Pacific Islands, but also around the world. For example, the recent flooding in Pakistan. So that's a major cause of concern. So that what the nature is telling us that we have to do something, and the scientists have shown that highlighted that it is caused by human. So it's anthropogenic by nature. So we have to do something. So what Vanuatu is doing is taking it to the International Court of Justice. So that's one avenue. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be a magic solution, but it's going to be one of the tools that it's going to be used. And it's not aimed to replace the Paris Agreement. I think the aim is to increase climate ambition, but also clarification of state responsibilities on climate change. I think that's very important. And the aim is not for the International Court of Justice to create new laws, but to evoke the existing laws that are currently in place. So it's just the interpretation of what the laws are currently are, but especially in terms of protecting the most vulnerable countries that are affected by climate change, but also protecting the current and future generations. So I think that's very important. I would also like to mention that this initiative initially was taken up by the students of the University of South Pacific. The law campus is based in Vanuatu, so they approached my government and they asked my government to take this issue to the International Court of Justice. So they are concerned about the future. So they will be living in a climate where the world is uncertain, the future is uncertain. So it is very important that we do not leave this to the unborn children to address climate change, but we have the tools, we have the scientific knowledge to address climate change. So that's one of the reasons. It's going to complement the existing architecture, but what we are aiming to do is to increase climate action and ambition. I think that's very important in terms of the national determined contributions. So far, what we are currently doing is a diplomatic work, so we have to take it to the General Assembly, and our plan is to take it up in this session, on the 77th General Assembly. So we are working very hard to talk to other countries as well. So we are talking to across a section of countries in other parts of the world, like in Africa, in Latin America, in the Caribbean. So far in terms of the leaders' declaration, we've got one from the Pacific Island Forum leaders. They have called for an International Court of Justice advisory opinion to be discussed at the General Assembly. And also the CARICOM leaders, they have already endorsed the initiative, and also the Organization of African Caribbean States, the ministers and the leaders, they also call for action on climate change for the International Court of Justice to look at climate change. So we have this leaders' declaration in place. So what we are currently doing here at the UN is to lobby for support, advocate, and try to socialize the issue. And we hope that not only developing countries will be championing it, or the small states, but also major developing states as well as developed states. So I think it is very important. Like we have heard, I mean, the geopolitical tensions, the geopolitical issues or security issues are very important also. But for us in the Pacific, it is the climate change that's the single biggest threat. So that's highlighted in the Boyd Declaration and the Pacific Island Forum communique. So I think that for us it's very important. I mean, the impacts we all know. So that is what we are currently doing. Vanuatu is leading it, but of course with other countries, trying to form a coalition here at the UN. And we hope that by December, January next year, we will be able to table it and vote for the resolution.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Tarcisius, if I wanted to, you point out an interesting kind of tension between the capacity problem, but the need for surveillance for IUU, right? Like there is a need for surveillance given the extent of the exclusive economic zone, but the capacity does not necessarily always lie with the island states, but how that could actually lead to some sort of, or excessive surveillance, or surveillance not just intended for, I suppose, illegal fishing. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more on that tension of the threat or perhaps the concern over surveillance while welcoming partnerships that does address the issue of illegal fishing, which can be achieved through surveillance. And if you wanted to talk a little bit on that, on the Information Fusion Center in Vanuatu, Ambassador, I would turn to you also on that if you wanted to add anything on that.
So I raised that issue because, as I said, the region has become at the center of increasing geopolitical competition, while at the same time Pacific Island countries as sovereign nation states individually have a relationship with a whole lot of countries, including China, the US, Australia, and so forth. And multilaterally, they have discussions as a region with all these countries. And therefore, the Pacific Islands region has for a long time, as many of you know, been an area where the West, led by the US and Australia, and also France, been the dominant power. And they see it as their region, and where they also have responsibilities and commitments to surveillance. But there is, I think, a possibility in the future that Pacific Island countries could also look elsewhere. And when I say look elsewhere, I mean look at places like China to assist in those things. And China is an important development partner. But while that is true for Pacific Island countries, it could cause tension between the different superpowers. We've seen recently, and I'm not saying that this is connected to this, we've seen recently the issue arising in Solomon Islands in terms of a U.S. Coast Guard ship not being allowed into the Solomons. And although I think the details of that are much more complicated than what we see in the media, I think some people are interpreting that as countries like Solomon Islands saying to the US, no, we can also look elsewhere for such assistance. As I said, the Solomon Islands case is, I think, more complicated than just geopolitics. And so, I sometimes am concerned that there would be an increasing securitization of maritime security in the way that the West defines security, and also an increasing securitization of climate change issues, interpreting it in approaches that create tension between the global powers in ways that are unproductive to Pacific Island countries.
Thank you. Ambassador, did you want to add anything on the fusion center that's coming up, that's in Vanuatu, and how the region sees it, how you see it? Is that a useful mechanism and framework? Because there are similar ones in the Indian Ocean, and again, they are essential frameworks and forums to address, because of the vastness of the ocean, not just illegal fishing, but also, as I think we heard the Prime Minister of Tonga talk about, drug trafficking, human smuggling, and a range of issues that happens in across the highways of the ocean.
I'll be brief to provide my response. I think Dr. Tarcisius mentioned about the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. And we have a small land but huge ocean that is surrounding us. So I think the challenge for us is the resources to monitor our EEZ, and even beyond our maritime jurisdiction. That is a major challenge. So he was talking about partnership. So multilateral engagement or bilateral engagement will be very important. So we have Australia and New Zealand, which are located in the Pacific. So they have a natural interest to help the Pacific. So I think that's very important. But let's not also forget that the United States is also a Pacific country. So they also have an interest. So we can all work together, I think, to address illegal fishing as well as the human trafficking and drugs that are going through the Pacific. But also China is there, it's in the Asia-Pacific region, so you cannot run away from them. But for us, I think our interest is to ensure that our region we still maximize the benefits of the oceans that can provide, but also there is peace, but also what we are trying to tell other countries that we also have challenges. So the Pacific Vision Center is based in Vanuatu. We hope it will improve our maritime security, as well as provide important data that can be able to enhance our surveillance in the future.
Thank you, Ambassador. And there's a fusion center that's there in India for on the Indian Ocean side, and perhaps there could be potential again on sharing of lessons and information on how the two sides of the oceans and the island states perhaps work on that. Anna, if I can turn to you, and I think one of the things Dr. Tar brought up as well as the strategic framing of the Indo-Pacific, I suppose, that that it's more, is it problematic, or is it asking countries to, I suppose, take sides or choose sides? I personally, as a researcher for maritime security, I like the term because it puts maritime domain at the center of kind of the area in a time where we are coming out of a lot of continental issues especially from the US, whether it was on Afghanistan or the Middle East, but Indo-Pacific looks at it, provides a maritime perspective to it. And I think New Zealand has been one of the countries that have perhaps has been late or has not always shared the same level of enthusiasm on the concept of Indo-Pacific as much as perhaps the others have, and including your neighbors. And I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit on in the framing of the Indo-Pacific and the sentiment on the ground from the region on how that is being viewed, and if there are any tensions on this. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you could hear me properly. Did you hear me? No? Okay, all right, so I guess that, I'm so sorry, Hannah, I think we are having some technical difficulties in reaching you. So. Are we able to? No? Okay. Anna, I don't know if you can hear us, but hopefully the team can write to you and chat, but I don't think so we can reach you at this point in time. From your expression tells me you can't hear anything I'm saying. All right. Maybe I can address the same question to the two of you, and how do you look at the framing of the Indo-Pacific and the concept? I think different countries look at it differently, and I just was sharing how I, as a researcher on maritime security, look at it, because it's it places the ocean at the center of a geography, but that's not necessarily, I suppose, how everyone or every country views it. And you'll hear different perspectives, whether it's in ASEAN, whether it's in different areas. So I was wondering what that perspective is in the Pacific. I can turn to you first, Master.
Well, thank you. I mean, the Indo-Pacific, I mean, that's a huge geographical area. It goes as far as India. So I think for us in the Pacific, I think we want to be seen not to be an afterthought. We want to be seen as we are placed as in the center. So I think for us, it's not more about military but for us it's climate change, achieving sustainable development. I think these are very important areas that we are focusing. I know there are issues about China and also other threats that are coming from other parts of the world. But I think for us, we hope that this type of tools will strengthen our sovereignty. It is a very important question, but because I'm a diplomat, I cannot really go into detail to express my opinion on Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jara.
I'm not a diplomat, obviously. And I cannot pretend, like my one dog, to speak on behalf of any country. My concern with the Indo-Pacific idea was that it was an idea that was produced outside of the Pacific and included the Pacific without consulting the Pacific Islands region. And for me, it is not only a geographical mapping, it was also a strategic mapping of a region. And in strategic mapping exercises, the question arises, whose interest is it? And I think the interest is largely outside the Pacific. When the authorities or people in Washington, D.C. or Canberra started using the term Indo-Pacific and including the Pacific and saying that this huge area that stretches from the west coast of the US to the east coast of Africa is our area of influence. They don't quite say it that way, but an area where we have interest and where we hope to have a sphere of influence. And that's concerning. And I think that is why Pacific Island countries, through the Pacific Island Forum, have come up with this idea of the Blue Pacific, which is not only an expression of belonging to a place, but a pushback to the Indo-Pacific. That yes, you have your Indo-Pacific, but please take note that this is the Blue Pacific. And it is a place where we have responsibility and where we belong to. And because we belong to and have responsibility to this place, our concerns and our definition of security is much broader than the strategic concerns that you have. That it includes climate change at the center. And that's very clear in the 2018 Boyd Declaration. A much broader definition of security that is encapsulated in this idea of the Blue Pacific. And so the sad thing, though, is that the term that has emerged in the Pacific Islands is now appropriated and then used for another partnership that's coming out from Washington, D.C. and between Canberra, D.C., Wellington, Tokyo, and others. And so I see that as an appropriation of a Pacific Island idea and a Pacific concept of belongingness and using it for a different purpose. And also not going through the regional architectures that are important to the Pacific Islands region. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but like I said, I'm not a diplomat. So.
Thank you. I think, Anna, I'm going to try once again to see if, can you hear us can you hear me any better? Oh. All right, great. I was wondering, if you did hear any of the conversation that we've had, if you had any comments or anything you wanted to add, and also, Anna, can you hear us?
Can you just repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you had any remarks or comments on the conversation we've had so far, but also on New Zealand's own approach to the concept of Indo-Pacific.
Well, I have to apologise. I haven't been able to listen to a lot of the conversation that has been had so far due to the audio. In terms of Aotearoa's thinking around the Indo-Pacific, did you ask?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, Anna, that's what on the Indo-Pacific. Okay, I think, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So you asked a question about New Zealand.
To the Indo-Pacific. That's correct. I'm so sorry, Anna. I think we're just you're breaking up just as I'm saying the crux of the question. So I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties that we've had today. But let me turn to the floor here and see if anybody in the audience had any questions for our three panelists, but I'm not sure if I will be able to get anything to Anna. Yes.
Thank you very much to the panelists for providing this very broad overview. I had maybe a couple of comments and then a couple of questions as well. So, Ambassador, very much on sort of the taking the case to the ICJ. The Pacific Islanders have not had a very good experience with the ICJ. I'm thinking, for example, of the Marshall Islands case, for example. So one element that comes to mind is how optimistic are you of the outcome of that, and will that have any impact on the countries in that immediate kind of region? We've seen countries ignoring any kind of advisory as well in the past. So that's one aspect. Second, you talked about the ICJ as well as the efforts in the General Assembly, but I'd be curious to hear your opinion about efforts in the Security Council to link climate change and security, this resolution which didn't take off, and whether something like that would be useful or beneficial at all to the Pacific Islanders in general, but also in specific, to your country. I guess the second question, if I may, to all the panelists, and if we can, if New Zealand can hear us as well, would be this notion of, of course, we're looking at the effort of preventing the severe impacts of climate change. But is there also thinking as to what on the likely outcomes if we don't succeed in that front? I'm thinking in particular about the potential of refugees and climate refugees from this region, and where would they then sort of go? And is there some sort of element of that of the other countries in the region thinking about it? I'm thinking New Zealand, Australia, but China among others as well. And is there some sort of thinking on that in that direction, and some effort to sort of say, well, if it comes to that, then are there possibilities that we might want to explore as well? I'm sorry, long-winded. By apologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we can take these two questions and then go back for the second one. Ambassador, on your ICJ, the question on ICJ, how optimistic you are on given the history and your conversation at the Security Council on this?
Well, I am optimistic that we can take it to the General Assembly, given the number of countries that have already shown support. So I think we can get, even some developed countries also have shown a keen interest on the initiative. You mentioned about the history. I think I think what's important is the crafting of the question. And I think that's very important. But also we have ICJ lawyers, people who have experience in that process. They're helping us. So I think that's very important, that we have the best legal minds that are helping us to take this issue forward. So we're not trying to ask the International Court of Justice to create new laws, because that's not their role, but to interpret the existing international laws that are currently in place, or the frameworks that are currently in place. So that's what we are trying to do. So it's not going to be a silver bullet, but it's going to be a tool for climate negotiators in the future. They can use that as well. The pronouncements from the International Court of Justice, because it has legal weight, also it has a moral weight as well. So I think that's very important. So it is not legally binding, like you mentioned, but it can be used. I mean, we all believe in international rule of law, so I think that's one area. So we believe that it's going to be a global public good that will lead to development of progressive international law. I think that's one area. In terms of the Security Council, the discussions at the Security Council, they don't really want climate change to be discussed there. Even overwhelmingly, the majority of the Security Council, they're open for climate change issues to be discussed, but there are certain countries that oppose climate change and security to be discussed. So we have seen recently this year that it was vetoed, and some countries have abstained, even though overwhelmingly over 90 countries have supported it or have co-sponsored it. So it's going to be a challenge. But again, like Dr. Tarcisius was saying, a lot of issues are securitized at the moment. So that's the challenge going forward. And also the geopolitical tensions. These are some of the challenges that we are facing if we take it to the Security Council. So the Security Council, they're still concentrating on boots on the ground, the peacekeeping. So I think that's the traditional mandate that they're working on. But I don't think the issue of climate will be welcomed by the Security Council that is easy, even though overwhelmingly they will support it, but there will be few members who will veto against it. So for the Pacific Islands to take it to the Security Council, it's not going to work.
That's great. Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Tarcisius, you wanted to add anything?
Very quickly, thank you for the question. That's a really important question. And I, as a Pacific Islander, I'm really hopeful that the ICJ will be receptive to what Vanuatu is bringing forward. Our young people have worked hard on this, and as Ambassador mentioned, they started with students at the University of the South Pacific. And so, there's a lot of hope for the young generation on this, and I'm really appreciative to the government of Vanuatu for taking this forward. However, as Ambassador mentioned, it's a challenge, but it's one that we're willing to take rather than just waiting for things to happen. On your second question on refugees, this is not an issue for the future for some of the Pacific Island countries. This is an issue for now. That there are relocations within the region. Most of what we've seen so far is adaptation and relocation within Pacific Island countries. Take, for instance, people from the outer islands, the Carteret Islands of Papua New Guinea, to places like Bougainville. In Fiji, of course, there are discussions about coastal villages and the need for relocation of people. In Solomon Islands, the government is working on relocating people from places like Sikayana and Nongtong Java to places like Guadalcanal. And so it's a now thing, it's not a future thing. Now the question of migrating out of the Pacific, that's more complicated and also depends on the immigration regulations and countries like Australia and New Zealand. And that's something that I think our Pacific Island countries are discussing. The former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, said that, for him, the question of whether Kiribati people will have to relocate is not a question of if, but a question of when, given the fact that the ability to sustain livelihood within Kiribati might not be the case in 50 years. And so he said that for him, the issue is about preparing people for when they are relocated, because he wants his people to migrate with dignity, that when they move to other places, that they can contribute to the communities where they settle. And therefore preparing his population is a response to climate change. And so that, I think, is also really important for our Pacific Island countries. So yeah, a lot of these issues are not future concerns, they are concerns for now.
Thank you. I think we have one more question from the floor.
Hi, thank you all for your comments. I would just like to pull one thread here a little bit. I think this discussion highlights the degree to which many of the Pacific Island nations are sort of dancing on the head of a pin on islands and the like, highlight that. At the same time, we see that the island nations themselves are really potentially competing for economics, for trade. So I'm just wondering if you could quickly comment on how do you ensure coherence going forward so that the voices and the issues that you're bringing to bear are amplified and not suboptimized? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take that question, and maybe if Anna is listening in, she can attempt an answer as well. The Fiji ambassador yesterday, and the Prime Minister of Tonga, and of course Ambassador Odo, all mentioned the importance of regionalism and the Pacific. That is really, really important. Yes, our bilateral relationships are important, but we have seen that collective diplomacy is really, really vital for the Pacific. And therefore, there is a need, I think, to ensure that the regional mechanisms and processes through which we make decisions are followed and respected. And yes, the the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum said recently that there is a need for us to review and look at regional processes. But there is also a need to maintain those processes as well. And that's why, discussions that happen outside of those processes is really disruptive to our collective regional collective diplomacy. Things like what China did, for instance, and more recently, the partners in the Blue Pacific. I think those things happen outside of the regional processes and therefore concerning. So yes, regionalism is really important. We've seen it in the past in things like the Rarotonga Treaty or the Anti-Nuclear Treaty that the Pacific Islands came up with. And also in the, excuse me, in the multilateral tuna agreement with the US South Pacific tuna agreement. So regionalism is vital, just as our sovereign bilateral relationships are also vital.
Thank you. I think I'm going to give Anna one last try and see if you can hear us, if there is anything you wanted to add from the bits and pieces, I guess, that you were able to listen in from this conversation. Again, my sincere apologies for all the technical difficulties we seem to be having this morning.
I did catch that last question, and I just agree wholeheartedly with what Tarcisius has said. I would add too that we have heard a great deal, including from Washington, about listening to the Pacific, about Pacific Islands Forum centrality, a term that we often associate mostly with ASEAN centrality, but a sense that to engage in the region means to engage with the existing architecture, with key political groupings, such specifically the Forum. But my concerns is that despite the intent and the rhetoric, that the intentions will be overtaken by geostrategic considerations, geostrategic concerns, on whether those be Washington's or Beijing's, and that the desire to again, as I mentioned, to seek to shape the regional order in such a way that's favourable will actually have a detrimental effect of undermining regionalism. And as Tarcisius has just said, regionalism is very much the paraphrase, very much the buffer at the front line, given the challenges, both traditional and non-traditional, facing the region. And so I think just in answer to that last question, in terms of coherence of engagement, coordination, Pacific countries have been calling for better coordination amongst partners for a very long time. The fact that the Partners in the Blue Pacific initiative has come about this year does not reflect the fact that this is something that Pacific countries have been calling for. And this has been a deep concern amongst Pacific countries that the lack of coordination, the lack of cooperation across donors will undercut initiatives, undercut regional initiatives, and that there will be a lack of coherence as a consequence, a lack of coordination, a lack of coherence. And this also speaks to the consistency of engagement. And all partners, whether they be New Zealand or Australia or the United States or the UK or Japan, need to think very deeply about the consistency of their engagement in the Pacific. And this is something which I'm hoping is given the upcoming White House Summit with Pacific leaders, I'm hoping that there is a great deal of thought into how to be consistent and consistently good partners to the region in such a way that doesn't undermine regionalism, which is a deep concern for many. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And with that, I think I'll bring this panel to a close. Thank you both. Thank you, Anna, for joining us from there. And again, apologies for all the technical difficulties, to Ambassador and to Dr. Tarcisius. Thank you for joining us this morning to discuss the issues of maritime security and climate. And clearly, I think the message is that we do need to, and it's not, again, something new that islands have been talking about, but we need to think about the concept of security in a much more broader way, in a way that encompasses more than strategic concerns and issues of maritime security that are front and center to a lot of the islands across the Indian and Pacific Ocean. Thank you again, and please join me in thanking the panelists for this fantastic discussion. We have a short coffee break before our next conversation.